it's a great privilege to follow the noble Lord Griffiths with his most interesting and very personal recollections of a very remarkable person who I had the honour to serve for a considerable number of years in her time as Leader of the Opposition and as Prime Minister. And I've noticed in the discussions already, and the noble Lord Leader of the House referred to Britain being on its knees. And I brought with me my prop, which I used in successive elections, 1983, 1987. And some noble lords may be familiar with it. It was Sir Nicholas Henderson's valedictory dispatch from Paris, which he sent under the impression that he was retiring from the Foreign Service in March the 31st, 1979. He didn't actually retire, because no sooner had he got back to this country than I think Lord Carrington, the new Foreign Secretary, invited him to go to Washington, and he was a very successful ambassador for us and very important during the Falklands War. My Lords, I just read a few extracts from what he then said. It's entitled Britain's Decline, Its Causes and Consequences. It's written, incidentally, and I'm sorry the noble Lord is now not in his place, it's written to the Right Honourable David Owen MP, Foreign Secretary as he was at that time before the 79 election. Sir, since Mr. Ernest Bevin made his plea a generation ago for more coal to give weight to his foreign policy, our economic decline has been such as to sap the foundations of our democracy. And he went on to say, in the mid-50s, we were still the strongest European power, militarily and economically. It is our decline since then in relation to our European partners that has been so marked, so that today we are not only no longer a world power, but we are not in the first rank even as a European one. We are scarcely in the same economic league as the Germans or the French. We talk of ourselves without shame as being one of the less prosperous countries of Europe. And he went on to say, anyone who's followed American policy towards Europe closely over the last few years will know how much our role as Washington's European partner has declined in relation to that of Germany or France. And he ends this statement. This is not, in the view from the continent, which is our ambassador in Paris at the time, retiring, our standing at the present time is low. But this is not for the first time in our history, and we can recover if the facts are known and faced, and if the British people can be fired with a sense of national will. My Lords, isn't that what we are discussing here today? And isn't that situation now remarkably transformed? And I have to say, to start with, in showing the leadership for that national skill, if I have one criticism of a great Prime Minister, I do think she worked far too hard. I think the thing that I regret, and the only thing I remember at cabinet meetings occasionally, and one or two of my colleagues may recall this, was the stifled yawn because of the extraordinary time. I remember walking out of a reception in number 10 that she gave one evening, and she was saying goodbye to the various guests, and just ahead of me was a BBC producer from the World Service. And she said, well, I do like the World Service. She said, I listen to Radio 4 at 11 p.m. and 12 p.m. And then I switched to the World Service, and I listened to that at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And her commitment, and of anybody who worked with her, and her knowledge, and the way in which whatever subject came up, the background and work that she'd done, as the noble Lord Williamson and the noble Lord Armstrong remember better than any. Now, with all that pressure that she had on her, we've had a number of tributes today to her personal approach to people and her kindness. I just recall my own wonderful incident that I remember, which no lords will understand, does make a great impression. I came into the cabinet in the very beginning of January 1983. My mother died 2 weeks later, and I think the first cabinet meeting we had when Parliament came back, she took me on one side and said, did your mother know that you'd come into the cabinet before she died? And I said, yes, she did. And she said, I'm very pleased. And it was that sort of personal interesting people that made, I think, such an impact on all of us. I don't blame her for landing me with some of what I think were the nastiest jobs in government. I don't think that's quite fair. I was Secretary of State for Employment through the miners' strike, and I do agree with everything the Noble Lord Tebbit said. It was actually, and I think this also, about the comments made about the Falklands. Viewed by people afterwards, it may have looked as though decisions were easy. Actually, both of those were close-run things. Both of those events could so easily have gone wrong, and if they had gone wrong, it would have been the end of the Conservative government, it would have been the end of her as well as Prime Minister. And it was actually the reason that they came right, and I say this not having been so closely involved in the Falklands, but certainly involved very closely with Lord Tebbit and I was sitting on the emergency committee that we were, right through the miners' strike. It was a close-run thing, it was very tough, and there's no question that it was actually her determination that was really, I think, the crucial determining factor, both in the Falklands and in the case of the miners' strike as well. And then for a quiet life I went to Northern Ireland, where I had the pleasure of inheriting the plan that had been laid by the Noble Lord Armstrong, which didn't meet with an universal approval from the Unionist Party on its introduction, and we had some interesting time. And I do recall one moment when I think that both Margaret Thatcher and myself, looking suitably nonplussed, we had the signing ceremony in the large drawing room in Hillsborough, in front of all the television cameras and things. And Margaret Thatcher, the signing ceremony took place, and then she made a suitable speech saying how she hoped this would be the beginning now of a good relationship. It would establish more security and confidence in Northern Ireland and a better relationship with the government of the Republic. And then turned to Garret Fitzgerald and invited him to speak. And he started off in Gaelic. Margaret looked at me, and so I wouldn't know what he was saying. I'd only been Secretary of State for 2 months. I hadn't actually learned Gaelic in that time. And neither of us had an idea what she was actually saying. And it was a bit of a shiver went through the room until we got back into the English language, which was a relief. But of course her courage through that time, the very beginning, I happened to have a flat on the same landing as Erin Eve. And the bomb was, of course, placed in his car outside our block of flats, and the tilt switch did its deadly work when he came out of the House of Commons car park. But her courage then, at the very start of her election campaign, and she was just embarking on this terrifically demanding campaign, and I don't think any of us will forget the speech that she then made as a new Prime Minister, I think 2 weeks later, in St Martin's in the Field, in memory of her great friend Erin Eve, had so much to do with her success as leader of our party and as her spokesman previously on Northern Ireland. And then, of course, my lords, we had the Grand Hotel, and then, sadly, Ian Gow. But I remember that through all the difficulties, I agree entirely what the Noble Lord Armstrong said. Whatever comments come out now, later, about some reservations, she certainly backed me to the hilt all the way through as we sought to ensure that Anglo-Irish agreement brought benefits for Northern Ireland and for the United Kingdom. But I remember one particular event, and Noble Lord may remember this, which was the bomb outrage at the Remembrance Day service in Enniskillen, which was a shocking event, shocked everybody in Northern Ireland, right across the communities, and it was a really difficult time when some of the confidence that one needed to sustain was definitely slightly wobbly. And I said to her, we're going to have, the British Legion aren't going to allow their Remembrance Day service to be destroyed. We're going to have another service in 2 weeks' time. And I talked to Noble Lord Powell and her private secretary, and I said, what's she doing Sunday week? And he said, oh, she's got a meeting with President Mitterrand in Paris. And I said, what time's that meeting? They said, well, it's in the afternoon. And so I said, look, if we organise it, do you think she'd come to Enniskillen? And do you think she'd give the lead and the reassurance and the comfort that was so important at that time? And without hesitation, in spite of the fact that she was a prime target for the terrorists, as we know, all through her time, she didn't hesitate. She came. It was a wonderful cover, because the press, they said, what's she doing on Sunday with this big parade in Enniskillen? Oh, he said she's got a meeting with Mitterrand. And so, help of the RAF, she came in the morning. We had the great service. She got lashed with Fermanagh rain and got drenched, but didn't that put her off in the square in Enniskillen, and it was hugely appreciated. And then, of course, my lords, we had, I moved for a quiet life to defence, and I was able to see for myself the extraordinary respect with which she held in Eastern Europe. I think I was the first NATO defence minister to go to a Warsaw Pact country, and I went to Hungary. And I knew already her extraordinary respect that she was held in Poland for what she has done, which has already been referred to. And when I was in Hungary, they gave me a piece of barbed wire, a rusty old piece of barbed wire. What that was, my lords, it's part of the 200 miles of the Iron Curtain that had been for almost 50 years on the border of Hungary to keep the people back, those who wanted to move for a better life, and found that, and that the image right through Eastern Europe at that time, that they had, that she, above all, was a person to whom they felt enormous gratitude. And then, my lords, we had the Gulf War. And I do sympathise in one way with Saddam Hussein, because he wasn't to know that on the day that he invaded Kuwait, Margaret Thatcher would be in Aspen, Colorado, to receive the Medal of Freedom from the Aspen Institute, and that at that time, and that President George Bush was going to fly down the next morning to present the medal to her. And that was Saddam Hussein's bad luck. And as I travelled around the Gulf afterwards, in the first Gulf War, and there was no question, and you will find that the belief among the leaders of the Gulf countries, the debt they owed Margaret Thatcher for the speed of response of the United States at that critical moment. She attended, some may remember, such was her standing, and contrary to the Nicholas Henderson's valedictory report, such was her standing that she attended a cabinet meeting George Bush invited her, attended in Washington. And undoubtedly her determination saw the speed of the response that we got. And that determination and that respect did lead to some problems in government, because it was almost impossible, I thought at that time, for people to get elected in any country in the world without having on their election address a picture of them shaking hands with Margaret Thatcher. And we got a succession. I remember on one occasion, we had to have, the cabinet meeting had been brought forward. And she said at the end of the meeting, I'm sorry this is happening a bit earlier, but I've got to go to Derby. And somebody said, you're going to the Derby? No, I've got to meet Mugabe. That was an indication of the extraordinary range of people who needed to, wanted to be seen associated with her. And I suppose the ultimate sanction or the ultimate endorsement, some may remember that interview she did in the United States, showing how the standing of Britain and of Margaret Thatcher in Britain had changed so completely. An interview she did with Walter Cronkite. And at the end of it, Walter Cronkite turned to her and said, Mrs. Thatcher, will you accept nomination for the presidency of the United States? My lords, it's that leadership and that will that transformed our country. Her courage, her humanity, her goodwill and her friendliness to anybody who worked with her are things that we will never forget. And it's a great privilege for anybody to have the opportunity to pay tribute to a very remarkable person.
Lords, over a long career in broadcasting, I had many encounters with Mrs. Thatcher as she then was. Some surprisingly endearing, even tender, some extremely challenging, as you might expect, especially when I was at the BBC. I see Lord Turnbull with us today. When Mrs. Thatcher left number 10, the staff in her private office clubbed together to give her as a parting gift a shortwave radio, and Lord Turnbull in his remarks said, Prime Minister, as she was, I think, just for a day or so, Prime Minister, this is so you can be angry with the BBC all over the world. However, I first encountered Mrs. Thatcher almost 40 years ago when, as a young television producer in ITV, my colleagues and I, several I see here with us today in the chamber, chronicled the deepening crisis in the UK in that grimmest of decades to which many of your lordships have already referred, the 70s. A decade of stagnating state-run industry, of accelerating inflation touching almost 30%, of three-day weeks, of the Times unpublished for a year, of widespread industrial strife and thrombosis, a decade in which the UK had to turn to the IMF for a standby credit. On Weekend World, where I worked at the time, we canvassed proposed solutions to our dire circumstances on both left and right. We took a particular interest in the ideas of Keith Joseph, not mentioned yet today, and his then protégée, Margaret Thatcher. She did not emerge as leader of the opposition fully formed. I recall her as a tentative and nervous interviewee under Peter Jay's intense and rigorous cross-examination. Her fiery conviction would come later. When Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, the country was anxious for all that to end. But the resistance she had to overcome was still enormous, including, as others have said, from within her own party. But as we know, her conviction intensified, her determination grew, her courage proved formidable. Mrs. Thatcher set out single-mindedly to address her toxic inheritance, and in due course, she did indeed eliminate inflation. She introduced discipline to our public finances, she privatised the nationalised industries, and she brought the trade unions under a new system of law. All that reform was unavoidable, but it also, as others have suggested, of course, came at high social cost. And in other ways, her premiership was not clear-cut. Mrs. Thatcher was an economic but not a social liberal. She was viscerally uneasy about Europe, but yet, as others have suggested, embraced the single market. She hated communism, but she championed détente. And as we all do, she left behind unfinished business. In her case, an under-resourced, underperforming public sector. And while she liberated markets and inspired a new spirit of enterprise in the UK, we would in due course learn that without strong and effective regulation, we would suffer gravely from untrammeled market excess. But if Churchill saved us from Nazi domination, and as Lord Tebbit has already mentioned, and if Attlee was the architect of a benevolent social state in the UK, it was Baroness Thatcher who reversed our post-war economic decline, who restored Britain's confidence and standing, and who offered her successors a chance to build a new Jerusalem. In an interview for the series on her premiership that she subsequently recorded after she left office for the BBC, Lady Thatcher declared, and I quote her directly, "The Prime Minister should be intimidating. There's not much point being a weak, floppy thing in a chair. That, my lords, she never was. She was a very great Prime Minister indeed, truly the right person at the right time, and the nation is deeply grateful to her."
My lords, reference has already been made to Margaret Thatcher as a scientist, and also to her strong religious beliefs. But there's yet another aspect to her experience which I think we should have in mind. That is that she was a member of the bar, having been a pupil to Lord Brightman, whom many of your lordships will remember here when he was here serving as a member of this House and did tremendous work in committees of the House in various ways and in various subjects. So she was a trained barrister. My first personal contact with Margaret Thatcher was when she phoned to me in Edinburgh on the Monday after the election in 1979, inviting me to become the Lord Advocate. Well, there followed a time of intense legal activity. At that time, the Lord Advocate was a member of the UK government. Now, of course, he no longer is. He's a member of the Scottish government. And the office of the Lord Advocate is to a great extent replicated in the office held by the noble and learned Lord Wallace of Tacterness. But at that time, as I say, I was invited by Michael Havers, who was the Attorney General, to cooperate with him in advising the government on a lot of different matters. The one that sticks particularly in my mind are the European matters, because it was a time of great struggle in Europe in relation to the contribution that the United Kingdom was having to make, which many thought was excessive. And there were suggestions that we could refuse to make our contribution. And a lot of advice was sought about that. And the thing that I remember particularly about Margaret Thatcher was that she was most careful on no account to do anything which was contrary to the legal advice she had received. Although, of course, from time to time, she probed the soundness of that advice. But assuming the probing had been unsuccessful in dislodging it, she never went beyond it. And I do think that work, although it was in a sense just legal work, had an effect in the way in which she was able to negotiate without the necessity of stopping paying the reduction in our contribution which she achieved. Many people thought it was with the handbag. I believe that it was with really strong arguments that had been developed in the course of these months before she went. My Lords, by 1987 I had become a Lord of Appeal in Ordinary, and I was sitting in this House listening to a debate about extradition when I received a call to come over to see the Prime Minister on Monday afternoon about 5 o'clock. And to my intense surprise, the Prime Minister told me that Michael Havers had earlier that day resigned for the reason of ill health, and she invited me to become the Lord Chancellor. And she said that she was very anxious to have it on the news at 7 o'clock. So the time for decision making was not ample, and that's what happened. Her decision in that respect, I think, must be regarded as very courageous. Her courage has been spoken of in other fields, and her courage in these other fields was beyond any question. But her courage in this field, I think, also was pretty remarkable, because a very highly placed legal authority said that if he had been asked to take on the controlling of the Scottish legal system, he would like to have known something about it before he did it. Your Lordships will be able to see, I think, what was intended by that. My Lords, the position that I was appointed to as Lord Chancellor was certainly one that in these days had a certain priority and protocol. I remember shortly after my appointment, my wife and I were invited to a state function at Buckingham Palace. And in these days, the protocol was, and it may still be for all I know, but the protocol was that the first couple to go in to meet the Queen and the guests, the royal guests from the other country, was the Archbishop of Canterbury and his wife. And the second was the Lord Chancellor and his wife. and the Prime Minister followed. And my wife could hardly contain herself at the idea of going in front of Margaret Thatcher into the royal presence. And Mrs. Thatcher just said to her, this is what you have to do. On you go. And so she had to do what she was told. Her character didn't allow for much debate on that kind of thing. I was completely free from any interference whatsoever in the work of the Lord Chancellor's Department while I held office from Margaret Thatcher. She never interfered. And in these days, as your Lordship will remember, the senior judicial appointments were made to the Queen, the nominations were made to the Queen by the Prime Minister on the advice of the Lord Chancellor. All has changed now, but that was the rule then. In no case did she ever interfere with any recommendation that I made for a judicial appointment. And I must say, I think that was a sign of extraordinary confidence and something that I very much cherish. As Lord Chancellor, as I said, the protocol in these days gave the Lord Chancellor a status which I think sadly has been somewhat affected by recent changes. And by the time Lady Thatcher resigned, Margaret Thatcher, she was still then, resigned as Prime Minister, it fell to me as a senior member of the Cabinet to express on behalf of the Cabinet our tribute to her. And I have to say that I was greatly assisted in the preparation of that tribute by Sir Robin Butler, as he then was, because we didn't have a lot of time in which to prepare this document, which had some importance, as we thought. She began to respond, but those of your Lordships who were there will remember that she had some difficulty in controlling her emotions. And somebody suggested that I should read her response, which of course she had written out. And I said, no, not at all. And I think that was enough to encourage her to carry on, because she got immediate control of her emotions and finished what she had to say. And your Lordships will remember that later that day in the House of Commons, she made possibly one of the best parliamentary speeches of her life. So she was prepared at the earlier experience, I'm glad to think. My Lords, as I said, my wife and I are very conscious of the tremendous support and kindness we received. I just illustrated with the one at Buckingham Palace, but that's one out of a great number. And I know that many people here and many people outside have experienced extraordinary kindness, extraordinary thoughtfulness from a woman who was extremely great.
It might be helpful, since we're almost at the halfway stage amongst those who wish to speak, if I give an indication of where I think we are from now on and the number that would still remain. So those who've indicated, please don't despair if you don't hear your name. It's just that you're going to be in the group after this. My Lords, my noble friend Lady Trumpington, I think, may wish to speak next. And then we return to the opposition benches, to the noble Lord Bhattacharya, who is ready to speak. Then back to the Conservative benches, my noble friend Lord Lamont, my noble friend Lord Forsyth, my noble friend Wardegrave. Then we return to the cross benches, the noble Lord Thomas of Swynnerton, who I know has been waiting for some time. Then back to the opposition benches, to the noble Lord Robertson. Back to the Conservative benches for the noble Lord Young of Graffham, noble Lord Deben, noble Lord Saatchi, and back to the opposition benches, to the noble Baroness Lady Dean, and back to the Conservative benches, to the chairman of our backbench committee, the noble Lord MacGregor, to noble Lord Hamilton of Epsom, and then we return to the opposition Privy Council bench, the noble Lord Gilbert, and then to my noble friends Lord Naseby and Lord Spicer, and after that I have presently about another 8 names to follow, including, of course, Lord Clinton Davis and others who are very much considered.
I do think that we perhaps owe a debt of gratitude to the staff here, who in the middle of the holidays have turned up. The food was warm, this place was as warm as it ever gets, and everything ran smoothly as though it was a perfectly ordinary weekday event in the middle of a session. So I think that we owe the staff a big debt of gratitude. Now, I had to speak today because I owe Margaret Thatcher everything. In 1980, she delivered her first honours list, 6 men and me, rather like today. I was so lucky to be here and to have worked for her and with her and fought with her. I do believe that the fighting was part of the whole process because she liked to have something to fight against which gave her ideas of what she could make up her mind about later. So I can remember some poor man who sat between us at a dinner, and I said, the Daily Mirror is quite right about the mentally handicapped. The Daily Mirror is never right. And that started us off. And this poor man sat, I think he thought we were going to hit us, and probably himself, in the middle of the dinner. But that was the way it was. And the alternative was the incredible kindness that I had on the odd occasion when I had to, in terror, attend a full cabinet meeting simply because my boss had been unable to get there. And I only had one remark, which was, Professor so-and-so should get this job. The Department of Education agrees. And I said it 3 times, and in terror. And I also had had the opportunity to see how the cabinet worked, and that was quite a revelation. But when the meeting was over and she was leaving, she came up to me and she patted me on the shoulder and said, "I'll see your professor gets the job." And that was the way we operated. It was either death to the end or eternal friendship, and I know which I would choose. I would like to send my very warmest sympathy to her family and to say what a great loss it is to me personally and to all her friends and admirers wherever. And just one other thing. It's a curious thing that out of all the speakers today, apart from the Baroness Royal, they've all been men, and none have commented on her beauty. Oh yes, I beg your pardon. But none have commented on her beauty. And she was a beautiful woman, and it took a Frenchman, a French president, to appreciate it, even though it had a twist, but that's typically French.
My lords, the tribute being paid to Baroness Thatcher demonstrates the huge impact she had on our national lives. Rightly so. No matter our political views today, so many of us are Thatcher's children. My lords, I'll be very brief, simply sharing my memories of witnessing Baroness Thatcher's famous drive, conviction, and determination firsthand as she worked to save and revive Britain's industries. Margaret Thatcher was that rare creature, a scientist politician, which many noble lords have just mentioned. She liked to get the facts and most definitely didn't like waffle. Those of us who worked with her witnessed some memorable handbaggings conducted with a very British forensic politeness. Sadly, there was much to be forensic about when Baroness Thatcher became Prime Minister. Manufacturing dominated the economic landscape, but in both government and private hands, our industries were underinvested, uncompetitive, and unsustainable, which made them dependent on life support from government. Our manufacturers were industrial basket cases, yet it seemed a political necessity to protect the jobs they represented. Our shop floors, like Longbridge, had become global symbols of industrial anarchy. My lords, Baroness Thatcher knew this was not merely the fault of the workforce. British managers were poor, they had no understanding of global competitiveness, product development, or design. They spent their time not managing companies, but managing their unions. By the 80s, Japanese technologies and products starkly demonstrated the fundamental uncompetitiveness of British industry. As Britain's first professor of manufacturing, I had the honor of having my advice sought as the government searched for solutions to this crisis. It was pretty bleak at times. I remember when it was first proposed to privatize Longbridge, nobody even wanted to buy it. But there was a solution: hard work for British pride. British businesses had to start working with foreign companies. Some resisted that, but not Baroness Thatcher. She always understood the importance of working better, working smarter, and then working harder. My lords, Baroness Thatcher was never anti-worker, as people think that she was. She certainly hated restrictive practices, barriers, and compulsion. But she truly wanted to give workers a chance to achieve, to improve their lives. That's why she came to my encouraging us to connect with industry, support advanced technology, and give industrial workers new skills and opportunities. That we did. What is Baroness Thatcher's legacy to British manufacturers? Through some very tough times, and despite much criticisms, she built a framework for prosperity, for giving British businesses the freedoms they needed to manage, invest, and trade. The removing of the shackles made a huge difference. What we didn't do is, after she left, to capitalize on it. From Birmingham to Sunderland, British and foreign companies who invested in the future demonstrated what could be done. For example, as a result of Baroness Thatcher's reforms, we now have a thriving automotive industry. Yet, my lords, too rarely have we seized this chance at industrial success that Baroness Thatcher's reforms gave us. For governments and business alike, the lure of easy, unearned money was perhaps too great, and that happened for 2 generations. It's perhaps ironic that the freedom that Baroness Thatcher so cherished meant that we suffered from the financial speculation she personally regarded with distaste. Baroness Thatcher preferred older, purer values: hard work, getting on, earning a place in the world. The whole world heard those values. Everywhere I travel, from China to India to Singapore to this very chamber, I hear echoes of Baroness Thatcher. The voice is familiar and firm. I suspect the noble Baroness would know exactly what to say to those responsible for our industries, and leave them in no doubt what they needed to do to get Britain growing. We talk about rebalancing the economy. She would have done this 20 years ago. My lords, that polite, insistent, forensic voice will be long missed by all who heard it.
My lords, I want to follow directly on what the noble Lord Bhattacharya has just said about manufacturing. But before I do that, could I just say what a wonderful treasure trove I think this session has been. It's going to be of great value to historians and people who write about Margaret Thatcher, because so much material has been produced in this period that we have been here. I won't go over the economic points. I agree with the things that have been said about how she saved our country, about how her name is synonymous with courage. I, as a huge admirer of her, of course accept that there was bound to be argument after her death, but I have to say, been somewhat shocked and saddened by some of the comments made outside the House, and I was so pleased that the Baroness Royal was so direct in her condemnation of those today. I do, however, understand some of the anger that was felt in some communities that were impacted by our industrial policy. And I wanted to comment on that because I was in the Department of Trade and Industry under the noble Lord Tebbit, and I was in charge of all the state-owned loss-making industries. And when Mrs. Thatcher appointed me, she said, your job is to work yourself out of a job, i.e. I was to try with Norman Tebbit to make them profitable and then privatise them. And there was, as the noble Lord said, a real problem in these industries of competitiveness and, of course, the cost to the taxpayer of sustaining these industries at a time when we were desperately trying to reduce borrowing. And, of course, there was the fact that the jobs in so many of these state-owned loss-making industries were not real jobs. They were jobs that were supported only by the taxpayer. And I always remember discussing with Ian McGregor, the chairman of the Steel Corporation, how in one instance he came to us and said it was necessary to make tens of thousands of people redundant in order that other people could keep their jobs later on. He said all the jobs would go if we didn't grasp the nettle and take the firm, painful decisions that were necessary. It was indeed, as Lord Bhattacharya said, because of the inadequate management that people like Neil McGregor, like Graham Day, like Michael Edwards were invited and asked to take charge of the industries to try and improve their productivity and move them towards profitability. But the problem of the one industry town or the one firm town was always in Margaret Thatcher's mind, and special measures were devised. But of course, once an industry has gone, that goes quickly. It takes a much longer time to get new investment in. Sometimes it happens, as with Corby, but it is a difficult progress. Some people said that Mrs. Thatcher and Sir Keith Joseph were going too fast, and therefore we should go slower. But to her and to ministers, it appeared that those who said go slower really didn't want to make the changes at all. It will be for historians to judge, but I think when they look back on it, they will be struck by the fact that so many other European countries saw similar declines in manufacturing as we did during that period, and things that were blamed on her were really an inevitable progression of European economies. One thing Margaret always did when there were factory closures in a constituency was she always agreed to see the local MP. And I know in some of the constituencies represented by Labour MPs, she had innumerable meetings with them because there were frequent closures. And there were some very improbable and likely friendships struck up between Margaret and people who actually opposed her and her policies on the floor of the House. Much has been said, and I would like to support it, about how she was really a person of compassion and concern. The stationer Smyson once told me that Margaret Thatcher was the biggest purchaser they ever had of little notelets, because she was always writing personal notes to people when they had hard luck or had a bereavement or illness in a family. And I have a little collection of notelets that I myself received. She was extremely loyal to people. I always remember when her PPS, one of her PPSs, Fergus Montgomery, was accused of shoplifting. And it was all over the Evening Standard. Prime Minister's aide accused of shoplifting. What was the first thing she did? She took him into the tea room and she went round the House of Commons with him, showing that she thoroughly supported him. And of course the charges were all subsequently dropped. I remember hearing of a meeting at which Ferdy Mount in the policy unit was present at an important cabinet subcommittee, and he had a terrible cold and cough and kept coughing. And Margaret said to him, "You've got to do something about that cough, and what you need is this." And she named some particular medicine. And he said, no. And she said, "Now, just a minute." And then she disappeared out of this important meeting, went upstairs for about 10 minutes, and then came back with a whole packet of capsules, which she then insisted that he took there and then. Of course, colleagues were thoroughly annoyed that this very important meeting had been disrupted in this way. But she was so informal in that way. I remember once helping her host a party in Downing Street. I don't remember quite what it was for, but after it was all over, she invited all the waiters who'd been pouring the wine just to sit down with her on the sofa and on the chairs round about. She poured them all a glass of wine and just carried on chatting to them and discussing the party. It was sometimes said that she was compassionate and concerned about drivers, secretaries and doorkeepers, but not at all about ministers. That wasn't true, though I did on one occasion protest to Keith Joseph about how she had handled a particular colleague during a meeting. And Keith Joseph looked at me in utter astonishment and he said, "Oh, really?" he said. "You know her method. She deals in destructive dialogue." And then he said, "She gives me the lash. They send a stretcher for me." And sometimes she could be very unpredictable in meetings. I remember one occasion when she had been on a plane coming back from the United States, and she sat on that plane next to the head of MGM Movies, More Gutsy Movies, a man called Lew Wasserman, who was the chief executive, and somehow he persuaded her on that journey that her crowning glory as Prime Minister was going to be the state financing of film studios in Rainham Marshes in Essex. I was Chief Secretary in the Treasury. This was revealed to me, and I expressed some bewilderment and astonishment at this proposal. And I said to her, but I thought we believed in controlling expenditure. Glare. I said, I thought we believed in low taxes. I thought we didn't believe in subsidies to inefficient industries. I got more and more desperate. I said, Prime Minister, there's no unemployment in Essex. Prime Minister will have to build the roads in order to get to Rainham Marshes. Glowering at me very fiercely. And then in desperation I said, you do know, Prime Minister, that we'll have all the environmentalists against us because there's a very rare bird, I knew about these things, called the Brent goose that breeds there. And she looked at me and she said, you are utterly hopeless. All you ever say is no, no, no. You do not have a constructive idea in your head. And if you had been in my government since 1979, I would have achieved nothing. And I did say to her, well, Prime Minister, you're always right about everything, but there's one thing you're wrong about. I've been in your government. Anyway, I went back to the department and I said, well, the Prime Minister's made a very strange decision. We must get on with it. A few hours later, a call came through saying she did not wish to pursue the matter. I saw her the next day, beaming. She congratulated me on something nothing to do with it, no reference to the matter whatsoever. It was always unpredictable dealing with Margaret Thatcher. She used to say, Thatcher's law is that the unexpected always happened, and she made sure that that was the case. She was a wonderful person, a person whose name, as I said, will always be synonymous with courage, a person who always did things for the right reasons. It was a huge privilege to have known her, and an even greater privilege to have been in her government, and I send my condolences to all her family.
Charlie. My Lords, I would like to join with those who paid their respects to the Thatcher family. It's a terrible thing to lose one's mother, but to lose one's mother in the glare of international publicity and commentary must be particularly hard to bear. And I think that we owe to Carol and Mark and the family a great debt for having shared their mother with us for so long, and all of us will be thinking about them today. Now, the shadow leader of the House, Baroness Royal, was kind enough to point out that I've from time to time helped Lady Thatcher when she's attended the House of Lords. It was becoming something of a burden, actually, because I found that trying to keep going with my job and being here to look after Margaret was quite difficult. So I thought I'd tackle this problem, and I said, you know, Margaret, you've been Prime Minister. You've done a great service to our country. You don't need to come here as often as you do. And she turned to me and she said, Michael, when we accepted appointment to this place, it was our duty to be here and attend. Now, how many times have you been here in the last 2 months? And that illustrated her love of Parliament and her devotion to Parliament. Someone said earlier that she was scared of nothing. She was quite scared of the House of Commons. I can remember seeing her knees knocking when she was making speeches. And that was because she respected the House of Commons. And when you were discussing policy, she would often say, what do we do about telling Parliament? This was always central to her, and she had great respect for our Constitution. I first met her through Keith Joseph as a young man in my early 20s at the Centre for Policy Studies, now so ably chaired by my noble friend Lord Thatcher, where they were trying to build the building blocks to turn around our country. As a young man, I was told Britain had no future. It was best to emigrate. Somebody wrote an editorial in the Times saying it would be impossible to govern without the support of the trade unions. And I thought, I'm going to have to get involved here. I never wanted to be a politician, but I ended up becoming a politician because of Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph and the battle of ideas. And ideas fascinated her. And whenever you had an issue, a policy, a discussion, she'd always start by saying, what are the facts? And then you would work out how you were going to sell this particularly difficult policy. Now, I got into it. She was quite forgiving of mistakes. I made a few. As a young man, I was involved in her leadership campaign. I was chairman of the Conservative Students. And we produced literature to encourage people to vote for her, which were aimed at young people. And I made the mistake of sticking one of the stickers on the party chairman's door in central office. And there was the most almighty row, because the slogan was, put a woman on top for a change. And I thought, she will never speak to me again. But typically, she pretended not to understand the double entendre. It's said that you can judge people by their opponents. And that has been used in the context of these disgraceful minority of Trots and socialist workers who've behaved so badly in recent days. Yeah. But I would just like to mention one thing, and that is Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown, as Prime Minister, invited Margaret to Number 10 on several occasions, actually. But on one occasion, she was invited for the unveiling of a portrait of Margaret, which had been commissioned and paid for privately. And in his tribute to her, he said, there are only 3 other oil portraits of Prime Ministers in Downing Street. One is of Walpole, which was the first Prime Minister, which hangs in the Cabinet room. The other was of Wellington, who saved us from Napoleon. The other is of Winston Churchill, who saved Britain and Europe from the Nazis. And he then went on to say, and I think it is entirely appropriate, Lady Thatcher, given what you have done for our country, that the third should be of you. Now, I was astonished by that, and then I thought, well, actually, it is possible in politics to recognise brilliance and achievement while still disagreeing, and I think that Gordon Brown deserves very considerable credit for recognising that. Now, the Noble Lord Williams mentioned Margaret's Methodism, and her religion was very important to her. But she could be pragmatic about that. In her latter years, a number of us tried to get her involved in social occasions. It's often said she wasn't interested in the arts and music and so on. That's nonsense. She was just so busy sorting out the country, she didn't have time for it. And so I invited her to Ascot. And she said, well, you know, I was brought up as a Methodist, and we're not really keen on this gambling. But I understand there are 6 races, and she opened her handbag, and she said, I've got £5 for each race, is that all right? Anyway, the first race was run, and she lost. And she looked extremely glum. And I'd sat her next to someone who was a racing expert, and I said, what's happened? She said, we've lost. And I said to this chap who's called Dominic Burke, I said, Dominic, if you lose the next race, you'll go the way of Michael Heseltine. And she said, that's quite right. And she won every single subsequent race. And she had all this money. And she said, I'm not sure the Methodists were right about this gambling. And was so pleased that she stood on the balcony and she joined in the singing of Roll Out the Barrel. And I thought, if only people could see the real Margaret Thatcher and not the Margaret Thatcher that's been painted as an image. A number of people have pointed to, my noble friend Lord Lamont talked about how she had a feel and an affection and an easy way with ordinary folk. When I worked for the Fleming's Investment Bank, we had a fantastic collection of pictures. She asked to see the pictures. And so I arranged a dinner when I had a number of really prominent people from the city who were coming to dinner, and they were all sat down and we finished looking at the pictures, and I was taking her up and everybody's waiting for her, and the lift door opened and a cleaning lady came face to face with Margaret Thatcher. And she said, oh, Mrs. Thatcher. She said, I like you. And Margaret said, my dear, what are you doing here at this time of night? She said, I'm just finishing my shift. And she said, I'm such an admirer of yours. And they got chatting. And she said, do you do the whole place yourself? She said, no, I've got all my friends downstairs, but they won't believe that I've met you. And she said, well, we'll go and meet them. And I'm saying, but Margaret, we've got a dinner going. She said, no. And she went down and she talked to all the cleaning ladies, and everybody else had to wait. And I think that was very much typical of the way in which she operated. Now, throughout her period since 1990, she has been supported by a magnificent team of people. Of course, Dennis was her main support until his sad death. But Mark Worthington, her political secretary, really worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and did a brilliant job, sometimes dealing with very difficult issues which came up from time to time, and her carers. But I'd particularly like to mention Cynthia Crawford-Croffey, who was with her from the start, who organised her wardrobe, and I can tell you she was very careful about how she used her clothes and how they could be recycled, but she always turned out absolutely immaculate, down to the last days when she was here just before Christmas for a lunch. I went to the last lunch which she did in number 10 before she left as Prime Minister. And Keith Joseph, who had been so much the architect of some of the ideas, and she, with her pragmatism and clarity of mind, had gone on to implement them, paid a handsome tribute to her. He said she was a beautiful giant who'd achieved more than any of us ever dreamt would be possible. I cannot add more to that than he put it. He, who sadly is not with us here today, but made such a tremendous contribution quietly to the Conservative Party and its philosophy.
My Lords, it's a very great pleasure to follow Lord Forsyth, and I think the House has already paid tribute to his own role in support of Lady Thatcher in later years, and it is one that should indeed be on record. I was her last appointment to the Cabinet. It was in the run-up to the first Gulf War. I was going across as Minister of State at the Foreign Office every day, 2 or 3 times, and she said, come in, William, I want a word with you. You ought to be Secretary of State for Health. This was unexpected news to me, as it was to the rest of the country and certainly to the Health Service. She looked at me and said, I think you need a large whiskey. I will have one too. And then she said to me, and this is one of the points I want to make. Now, she said, Kenneth has stirred them all up. My noble friend, my right honourable friend Kenneth Clarke, I want you to quieten them all down. She was extremely pragmatic about that, pragmatic in the best sense about the Health Service. She made it perfectly clear to me that if I thought that the reforms which had just been launched were not well based, it was up to me to stop them. As a matter of fact, I came to believe that they were the right thing to do and tried to follow them through. But it showed one of the points that has been made today. She is often described as an ideologue. She wasn't. She didn't fall into the mistake of thinking there were grand theories that explained everything. She stuck to common, decent morality and then looked at the facts. I wanted to make 2 other small points in that relationship. It has been said already by Lord May, above all, and others, that her science training was crucial to her. I think it was. She's the first woman and only woman to be Prime Minister, the first scientist and only scientist to be Prime Minister. I hope there will be more of both. But she played an extremely important part, as Lord May said, in a number of crucial scientific issues, of which perhaps the most famous was the work to take action to first of all, stop the production of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which were damaging the ozone layer. It didn't harm, of course, that some of the crucial science that had been done, which led to the proof of the damage to the ozone layer, had been done by British scientists, by the British Antarctic Survey. So it was respectable science. But she acted, and it wasn't always so successful. I was trying to persuade her, as a minister in the Department of the Environment, to put flue gas desulfurization on the power stations to stop acid rain. She didn't want to do that, partly because she didn't want to put the price of coal up even more and damage the coal industry. This may sound paradoxical to some, even more. I had a plot with Horst Teltschik, who ran Chancellor Kohl's Chancery Office. I said to Horst, will you get your man to, in a bilateral summit we were having in Bonn, to really put some pressure on this, because I think she might move. She obviously saw me coming a long way in advance. We arrived in Bonn in helicopters and all the rest of it. We got out. There was a local inversion, a local hot day, and there was a local smog, therefore. Now, Helmut, she said to the cowering Chancellor, he was always a little nervous of her, as others. Now, Helmut, she said, I'll tell you what you've got here. You've got an inversion and you've got a smog. Now, if you had proper clean air laws, like we do in England, that would put paid to all that. And I'll explain the chemistry to you, if you like. He didn't want to know the chemistry, and no more was heard over that weekend of my plot. She was not an ideologue. She was somebody who looked at the evidence. Two more small, Lady Williams said, of course, that we mustn't forget the towering contribution of Gorbachev to the reformation of Europe. But who was it who spotted first that Gorbachev was the person who we were going to be able to do business with? A footnote here, we should pay tribute to a brave man, Oleg Gordievsky, who briefed her that Gorbachev was going to be a man you could do business with. But then she, if you like, sold Gorbachev to Reagan, and the rest was history. And another one where she is often misinterpreted. She understood that F.W. de Klerk was something different, and that all the clamour about sanctions was irrelevant. She preserved the position of Britain so that when things began to move in South Africa, well briefed by a formidable ambassador in the noble Lord Rennie, we had leverage, and we could say to de Klerk, we will help you do this. And that is what Mr. Mandela himself recognized, and he himself paid tribute to her role in the final transition days from apartheid in South Africa. It is a crude and completely ignorant caricature to say that she was on the wrong side. When it came to, in South Africa, when it came to it, she played a crucial part. Now, I think the House deserves one apology from someone like me. I am a member of the University of Oxford. She loved the University of Oxford. I was present once when she was at a dinner at Somerville, my mother's college, where she spoke so movingly about what Somerville had meant to her, a grammar school girl coming into the world, and how passionately she supported equality of opportunity that those colleges provided. It was a disgraceful example of the perennial ineptitude of the collectivity of the University of Oxford, which has nearly always managed to get these issues wrong. They got it wrong over Asquith, they got it wrong over her, but it remains a disgrace. And I only wish, my lords, that there was some way of putting that right posthumously. There isn't. In 1973, my then boss, Lord Rothschild, made a speech, or at least he gave a lecture which was then leaked, saying that in the year 2000, Britain would be half as rich per capita as France. This caused displeasure to the then government of Mr. Heath. It didn't happen. In the year 2000, we just overtook France. What had happened in between? My lords, Lady Thatcher had happened.
Very good. Lords, I had the pleasure and drama of being the chairman of Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, referred to so warmly by the noble Lord Forsyth a minute or two ago, for all her time in power. It was a great privilege and great fun, I have to say. Well, she asked me to undertake this. I said, but Prime Minister, I don't know economics. She said, economics doesn't matter. History matters, and you know history. And I think she thought that. She thought that the background, the historical background to events were more important than anything else. For example, when she went to Russia, the Soviet Union, for the first time, she arranged a meeting of historians of the Soviet Union of great distinction, such as Leonard Shapiro, Hugh Seaton Watson, Isaiah Berlin, George Urban, and others, to discuss the historical legacy of Russia and how far Russia could be said to be influenced by its own history, even in Soviet days. And the same thing was true about Argentina. She was interested in the history of the countries to which she went. Once I summoned up my courage and wrote an analysis of the different dynasties of China, which I think, I hoped would help her when she went to Peking for the first time. I gave this to her, and I saw the surprised eyebrows of that great sinologue, Sir Percy Craddock, rising in laughter. Incidentally, Sir Percy was one of the many people in the civil service whom she greatly prized and appreciated. I think it's worthwhile mentioning something which hasn't been mentioned hitherto, namely her historic position in foreign policy. It was a remarkable fact that by the late 80s, she was on the closest possible terms with Mr. Gorbachev, the Secretary General of the Soviet Union, and at the same time a great personal friend and ally of President Reagan. To be great friends of the Soviet Union and of the United States was a remarkable and unique achievement. I don't think we ever had that, even in the days of Sir Winston Churchill, when the doubts about Stalin were always present, lurking in behind. I happened to go to a dinner in Downing Street the night that the Argentines surrendered, and historian President Sir Michael Howard pointed out that the victory which we had over the Argentines was a victory which hadn't really had an equivalent since the Battle of Agincourt in terms of the number of people killed on our side as opposed to those killed on the enemy side. Not since Agincourt, said Margaret Thatcher, who appreciated the illusion vigorously. Margaret Thatcher was always concerned with things other than economics, and it was a pleasure to have worked with her for such a long time and to have had such an interesting and moving time working at her disposal as I was for 10 years.
Well done. Well done. Join with others in expressing my condolences to the family of Lady Thatcher. She was very much a matriarch, not just in the cabinet but in the family as well, and this must be a very tough time for them. Some 3 years ago I was looking after Baroness Thatcher at the annual ball of the British Forces Foundation, where she was a patron and I serve as a trustee. So I said in the casual conversation that was actually very difficult with Baroness Thatcher, I saw Carol on the television the other night, and she said, oh yes, she said, Carol was on, she said, she speaks too much sometimes. And I said, I wonder where she got that from. And she said, from her father, of course. But I was a foreign affairs spokesman on the front bench for the opposition for 11 years, probably a world record for anybody in that position. And I saw 29 Foreign Office ministers come and go during that time, but only 2 prime ministers. So I had that specialised vision of the Prime Minister going from the Euro enthusiasm of her speech at Bruges, which still reads well today as an epistle to Britain's strong position in Europe, to that famous day in the House of Commons when she quoted Jacques Delors and said, no, no, no. My memory was not of the no, no, no emphatically delivered. It was watching the face of the noble Lord Howe, the Deputy Prime Minister, as she said these words, no, no, no. It was as if he'd been slapped across the face with a dead fish, and clearly had a major impact, and perhaps that was the beginning of the end of the Thatcher era at that time. When I was appointed as Secretary General of NATO in 1999, on the very same day I received handwritten letters from both Jim Callaghan and Margaret Thatcher congratulating me on the job that I was about to take and offering me the best wishes for what I was about to go and do. And it was a remarkable thing to get 2 such letters on the same day. But I had a lot of experience in foreign affairs to take with me to NATO. A lot of what I had to do in opposition was to, in many ways, agree with the government over the Falklands, over Hong Kong and the rest of it, and also had to attend a whole series of functions held by the government. Indeed, I used to think Lancaster House was basically my works canteen. But I went to one lunch in Downing Street one day with Russell Johnson, representing the opposition parties, in honour of the King of Tonga. The King of Tonga was a very large gentleman, but with a very small voice. Russell Johnson and I were very keen to get back to the House of Commons for question time at 2:30, but recognised that we could not leave before the principal guests had left. So we waited to the last second. Mrs. Thatcher walked out of the room with the King of Tonga, escorting him to the lift. Russell Johnson and I shot down the stairs, but were overtaken by the Prime Minister. And she said, "Oh, the King is in the lift." Clearly, if the King of Tonga was in the lift, nobody else could get in the lift as well. And I said, "Yeah, well, he's quite a sizable guy." I said, "but very difficult to hear at the back." "Oh," she said, "wasn't it fascinating what he said?" With her eyes glowing, she said he's probably the first Prime Minister in history to go on to become King. And Russell Johnson and I had the same thought at the same time, and neither of us had the courage to say it. So she was a remarkable person, and as I travelled both as Defence Secretary and then as Secretary General of NATO, I realised that she was a very significant figure outside of the country, as her popularity was declining in this country and indeed within her own party. There was absolutely no doubt that the pioneering instinct that she had had, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, was well registered and well recorded, and will be there for a long time to come. And now, as I've had a lot to do with Russia and NATO, I was the first chairman of the NATO Russia Council. I recognise that they saw in her somebody who was strong in her beliefs, strong in what she stood for, and they respect strength. The collapse of the Soviet Union, which occurred, I remind the House, 30 months after their exit from Afghanistan, was a seminal moment in world politics, and we can't underestimate, however much we disagree with her in her areas, about the role that she played in that particular move and that particular tectonic shift that took place in the world as well. But for my time in the House of Commons as the MP for Hamilton, I had a different view. The county town of Lanarkshire, which is Hamilton, overlooks the River Clyde, and beyond it the sort of towering industrial cathedrals of Ravenscraig, Gartcosh and Dale, the great steelworks of the west of Scotland. They don't exist anymore. Now maybe they were going to go anyway, because heavy steel and engineering and the coal industry are perhaps in decline all across the Western world. But it was, as some of her former ministers have said, the way in which it was done which left the lasting impression, and which will cloud the memory of somebody who made such an impact on British life. And I think that that is something that we have to register and we have to remember. She was a mixed blessing, of that there is no doubt. And I've got a feeling that some of these distasteful and disgraceful demonstrations that have taken place in the streets might well have pleased her, because she was not somebody who expected acclaim and unanimity, whether it was in the European Council or in the country as a whole. I remember the night that my friend Lord Forsyth of Dunlean organised a special dinner after 9/11 for the employees of, I think, J.P. Morgan Chase, who had died in the attacks on the World Trade Center. And Margaret Thatcher was there with Dennis at the table. And she made some comment about me speaking at the dinner. But anyway, she was quite cordial. And one of the things that was done was, at the end, was a toast, the loyal toast to Her Majesty the Queen, followed by a toast to the President of the United States of America. So I leaned in across and said, what if there was a toast to the President of the European Commission? She looked at me and she said, the words will never pass my lips. She was a great lady. There will be mixed feelings about her, but there is no doubt about the impact she had on this country.
My Lords, it's a great privilege to actually be able to pay tribute to the memory of Baroness Thatcher. I was her creation. It was the noble Lord Tevitt who put me in the Manpower Services Commission. She invited me into Cabinet, and for 5 years I had the privilege of working closely with her. I don't want to talk about those. Much has been said about the trials and tribulations of what happened over that decade. But really, taking the words of Premier Chou En-lai when asked whether the French Revolution had been a success, it's too soon to say. I believe that the perspective of Margaret Thatcher will change as the decades go by, and her reputation will grow. But there is one aspect that's not really been covered that I would like to mention, and it's been covered partially, but it's her compassion, her greatness as a human being. Much has been said about the Falklands, but a little-known fact about the Falklands was that every night during the 6 weeks of the campaign, she would have a list of the casualties, and every night before going to bed, she would write a long handwritten letter to the parents or to the partner explaining how they lost their lives and in what good cause it really was. And I was to experience this myself 2 or 3 years later. My young brother, Stuart, who was chairman of the BBC, died. And on the day he died, by the time I got home, there was a 3-page letter from Margaret, wishing, condoling me, talking about Stuart. An hour later, I got a phone call from Shirley, his widow. She had just received a similar letter, quite entirely different in context. And later on that day, my mother rang me, and she had also received a letter from Margaret. Now, how many serving prime ministers would take the trouble to actually do that? And I've one other little story just to show that side of a character. After she had left office, my wife and I took her and Dennis out for dinner. And we were sitting at the Savoy when a waiter spilled something over my wife's dress. Margaret grabbed her arm and said, "Don't say a word." So my wife looked up. "If you complain, he'll lose his job." Now, how many people would actually think that way? So in all the talk about the Iron Lady, I would like to pay tribute to a very human lady who accomplished so much for us all.
My Lords, I was chairman of the Conservative Party on that terrible night at Brighton. And I was with the noble Lord Butler, with Margaret Thatcher at that very time. It was very late. We were writing the speech. Those occasions went on forever. Yes. I thought I had the final bit. I knew I hadn't, of course, because there used sometimes to be speeches where I would be in the cellar writing on the auto cue as it moved and as she was speaking the bit that she decided she didn't like. But on this occasion, I just walked across the corridor. Lord Butler was finishing some work with her to get the final speech photographed, and this terrible bang took place. And automatically we all got to the floor. All the girls who were working in the office running off this speech. And there was a second bang, because the roof had lifted off and it then dropped again, sounding like another explosion. And the dust began to fall. And I moved towards the door and on my knees and opened the door and put my head round the door. And on the other side, the door to Mrs. Thatcher's room opened, and she was on her knees looking round the door. Tragicomedy is the only word I can say. And it was that mixture of what has happened, what should we do, don't we both look silly? And she got up, brushed herself down and said, right, but we better get on with something. What do we get on with? Because we had no idea. But she knew that things had to go on. And you know, she never said the party conference will continue. Everyone assumed it, because we knew, and that was the point that the noble Lord Tebbit made, we knew exactly how she would react and precisely what we would be expected to do. So we went off and organised the continuance of the conference. Nobody asked the question except the local chief of police. And we soon told him that he'd better not ask her that, or he might be in even worse trouble than he clearly was going to be. And so it continued. It was a harrowing and difficult time. I was lucky enough to help write a lot of her speeches. She actually kidnapped me after a speech I'd made at a wedding. And she said, would you come and help me? I wasn't in Parliament at the time. Would you come and help me write speeches? And I was surprised, because I don't come from the same part of the party that she came from, and I wouldn't automatically have been thought as the natural writer. But once she knew you were loyal, once she knew you cared about her, it was absolute. The relationship was absolutely one of trust and of confidence and of support. Indeed, she occasionally would say, don't listen to this, John, I'm going to say something nasty about Europe. She would then say it, and then she'd say, you can listen again now, and we would move on. Indeed, I couldn't understand why I was seated next to her on the day in which we went with the Queen to open the Channel Tunnel. And there were the current cabinet, and I was the Secretary of State for the Environment, and there was the cabinet that had agreed it. And she was sitting there, and I was sitting here. I couldn't quite understand why. And I realised that I was the foil. As we moved out of the station, she said, this has got nothing to do with the Germans, you know. It's entirely the French. But I don't see why we import all that food from France. Why should we buy French cheese? We've got perfectly good cheese of our own. So I realised she wanted an argument. So an argument we had. And the argument went terribly well. And we were halfway through the tunnel before either of us recognised that we had actually gone into it. It was absolutely a typical part of what she loved, which was to discover where she wanted to be by saying something which she demanded a response to. And her only demand was that you were rigorous in your argument. I've watched her destroy people who were not her unequals. She never set people down if they were in a humble position. But she destroyed people who pretended that they knew the facts and came ill-prepared. You never went ill-prepared to a meeting with Margaret Thatcher. I do want to support comments that have been made about her amazing kindness. You grew to have an affection for her which was really very deep indeed, even though you so often disagreed. Very, very unusual ability. And it's partly, as the noble Lord Young has said, of her kindness to us all. Those late night meals in her flat, because you hadn't had anything to eat. The first thing she would ask if you were late, have you had something to eat? And I've eaten more coronation chicken produced by Margaret Thatcher than anywhere else and on any other time. I think she did know how to cook other things, but that was what the staple diet was. And she always knew about your family, she always asked about your family, she was always interested in the family, she knew their names, she never forgot any of those things. And when you thought the number of people she had to deal with, it was remarkable. Of course, she could make terrible mistakes. She came to my constituency in the election of 1979 when she won, and she did it as a favour because I was fighting a seat which the Conservatives normally, and indeed always, have won. But she made her time to come, and she arrived at a farm. We decided it would be very good she went to a farm. So we went to the farm, she arrived at the farm, and there was a rather ill calf. She was not supposed to touch the calf. We had a nice fluffy lamb for touching. She walked up to the calf, put her arms around it, and picked it up. It was very heavy. Photographers, fantastic, wonderful. And she said, I'm going to call it Victory, holding this calf up. We put it down. It was ill. We got every vet in Suffolk there. We hid the calf from public eye and we kept it alive until after the election. We were terrified that this blooming calf would die on us. But I want to say two very serious things about it. First of all, I want to echo the comments of the noble lady and my very much loved friend, Lady Trumpington. Margaret Thatcher was a very beautiful woman. She had beautiful hands and she had lovely ankles. And she knew precisely how to use both. And any woman who is stupid enough to think that there is something unsuitable about using the gifts that God has given her should be ashamed of themselves. And she knew perfectly well that she didn't use that because she wasn't as good as men. She used that because she was better than men, and she also wanted a bit of advantage on top. It was a pleasure to see her, the way she turned herself out, and the way she never forgot that she was a woman. And the second thing is, I think history will remember a rather special thing about her. She was a very cautious woman. She did not take on things lightly, and she took them on one at a time. She recognized that you couldn't have a whole series, a whole plethora of interventions, of initiatives, of new ideas, of headline grabbing ideas. She knew that you only won things by taking them one by one and fighting them through and succeeding one by one. Caution is one of those things that doesn't normally go with the charismatic leader. But one of the reasons she stayed so long and was so successful was she didn't do the abolition of the dock labour scheme until she had dealt with the problems of the mining industry. She didn't move to privatise water until she'd made sure that people recognised that it was the only way to pay the bills. She did have a quality of caution, which is something which very few people of her strength have ever evinced. So it was a privilege, a pleasure, an enormous fun to work for her. It was never expected. It changed utterly all the time. You never knew what she was going to say or how she was going to receive a carefully crafted few paragraphs. But what you did know was that you were in the company of greatness. She was a star, and stars rarely come. And when they do, we should recognise them without rancour, and we should certainly not say, well, it's not quite as bright as we'd like it to be, or it fell in a different sort of way than we might have liked. We should just say, thank goodness that our lives have been enlivened by that star.
My Lords, party loyalty, love of party, these words are often derided. They could lead to tribal politics, too much adversarial behaviour, tit for tat, punch and Judy, etc. Those words in the hands of Margaret Thatcher achieve a magnificence which I think only she could have been able to do. I have explained, my lords, how I know this. After she was deposed, the view arose in our party that it would be a good thing, because there was much tension in the party at that time, obviously. It would be a good thing if the former Prime Minister was invited to our party conference. It would be cathartic. She wouldn't speak, too dangerous, but that she would go onto the stage and receive the applause of the party, and that would be a cathartic moment. That was the idea. I was with her in the green room. It was in Blackpool. And of course, of making the kind of conversation one does in the green room at party conferences, she said, what did you do last night, Morris? I said, I had a lovely dinner with Professor Anthony King, who she knew. Where did you go? We went to a lovely restaurant, but a funny thing happened. She asked what? I explained that we were upstairs. Downstairs was absolutely packed, as all restaurants in Blackpool are during party conference week. But I explained to her that upstairs there was only our table for two, and the rest of the room was empty. And that here was a long table laid out for dinner for probably 16 people, and nobody came. Professor King and I had the room to ourselves, I explained. I also explained to her that when it came to pay the bill, the woman who owned the restaurant, I asked her, what happened to these people? She said, it was a shocking moment, my lords, I remember it vividly. I've never described this before, but I'm doing it now. It was a shocking moment. She said, you did this. Your party did this. Don't you realise, my husband and I, we can't keep this place running. Party conference week is the most important week of our lives. Without the money from party conference week, this restaurant would close. I said I was very sorry. I paid the bill and we left. It was very upsetting. She was in tears. I explained all this to Margaret, and then this is exactly what happened, my lords. She said, Morris, pass me my handbag. I didn't know what she was talking about. I passed her handbag and she started to rummage inside it, and she took out her pen. She continued to rummage inside and she took out a checkbook. And she said, Morris, what was the name of the restaurant you went to last night? I said, I think it was the Blackpool Brasserie. Blackpool Brasserie. She wrote on the cheque. Then she said, how much do you think they lost as a result of those people not coming? And I said, I don't know, £300, £350. She made out the cheque. She signed it, Margaret Thatcher. She tore it out of her chequebook, gave it to me, and said, I want you, Morris, to take this cheque to the restaurant, give it to the man and the woman who own this restaurant, and you tell them, Conservatives don't behave like that. Say, my lords, what a woman.
Mrs. Thatcher, she then was a truly remarkable woman. She was elected in 1975 as leader of the then Conservative Party, and I think we need to take into account the fact it wasn't just that she was elected the first woman leader of the Conservative Party and what she had to overcome, but her very humble background and beginnings, and the impact that had on women in Britain. I can remember quite clearly, whatever your political views at that time, we realised the huge achievement that she'd made in a party that we always regarded as male-dominated, the old boys, public school, and all the rest of it. And from the side came this woman that succeeded in being elected to the Conservative Party. At the time, one of my heroines, Barbara Castle, wrote words, and I paraphrase, Having listened to the last, she deserves to be elected. She's head and shoulders above any of her opponents, but I don't think they know what they're getting. How true that was. But 1975 was also another important landmark. It was the year the United Nations declared International Women's Year. It was also the year that the Barbara Castle Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act became effective. And that gave many of us in Britain, many of the women on all political parties and those of none, who felt that this was a turning point for us. This really was good news, and that women would start to make their mark more than they had been able to in the past. It would be on ability rather than a whole host of other criteria. And it is regrettable, my lords, that this quite remarkable woman, who was the dominant politician in the 1980s in my view, that her legacy didn't leave behind much of the growth of women coming forward and taking positions of authority. And I've heard today many stories, warm stories that I've never heard before, from Conservative peers in this chamber who, it seems to me, are stories of the family of conservatism. But I think we have to remember too that the public perception was not that. It was one of a leader who was a Prime Minister who, whatever political party a Prime Minister comes from, has a responsibility of trying to generate within the nation a feeling of one nation, a feeling of consensus and being able to move forward together. And yet that public persona of conviction and confrontation was what held back, I think, much of what otherwise might have been achieved. We've heard today about the trades unions. It's become a mantra. It's one of her huge achievements. And it's just as dangerous to sweep all trades unions into one pocket of description as it is any political party or any group at all. There were trades unionists who recognised that change needed to take place. There's a number of us sat on these benches today. I'd like to think I was one of them. Certainly Lord Young of Norwood was another, and indeed Lord Brooke of Alverthorpe. We're trying to make changes, but unfortunately that statement of the enemy within was probably one of the most polarising statements against any change that we would have been able to achieve, and made consensus difficult. Had Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister taken the same view with a number of the trade unions in Britain as she had with the President of Poland, and suggesting that he should talk to Lech Walesa and his fellow workers, maybe the outturn would have been different, my lords. So the trades union achievement of Lady Thatcher is actually something that history will deal with. Also, my lords, it will be for history to judge her. But I think we can all agree today that none of us would either support or condone, whatever our political views, of the demonstrations, the small number of demonstrations, I think we need to keep it in perspective, the demonstrations against Mrs. Thatcher and bizarrely celebrating her passing. It's not something that any of us identify with, and something all of us would certainly not condone. My lords, one of the other strong memories I have of Mrs. Thatcher was in her election. It was something that many on the Conservative benches in the Commons did not want. She won. She deserved to win. The last day of her office as Prime Minister was the brutality with which people in her own party treated her, somehow forgetting all that she had achieved for them. My lords, that was a disgraceful day in my view, and did not recognise the achievements that she'd made for the party. And to hear today all the support and warmth and memories that are given, I think that there are some members of that party who have forgotten perhaps the role they played in that very brutal downfall, one that I hope my own party have never done in the past and I hope would never do in the future to a leader. So history will judge Mrs. Thatcher, Lady Thatcher. And in conclusion, my lords, I join with those other members who send our sincere condolences to her son and her daughter and the other members of the family. It's a very sad time for them, and I think our sincere wishes go to them.
It might be helpful at this stage, since we are now beyond the 2/3 mark of those contributions from our backbenches around the House, if I give an indication of where I believe we now are with our remaining speeches, of which there are about 14, though others may yet indicate naturally they are to speak. One or two have decided that they will hold back for the moment. My Lords, I next expect to speak my noble friend, Lord Macgregor, who of course was a cabinet minister with the noble Baroness Thatcher, my noble friend. Then I expect to hear from noble Lord Hamilton of Epsom, and then from the opposition Privy Council bench, the noble Lord Gilbert, then back to the Conservative benches from my noble friends Lord Naseby, Lord Spicer and Lord Selkirk, and then to the cross benches to the noble Lord Butler, then back to the Conservative benches to my noble friends Lord Freeman, Lord Palumbo, Lord Mulsford, Earl Caithness, Baroness Cohoyne, my noble friend, my noble friend Lord Flight, and at the moment, finally, my noble friend Baroness Buscombe.
Lords, there is so much with which I agree in all the many tributes paid to Lady Thatcher today. But at this stage, I only want to add a few examples of my own about her qualities, bearing in mind the point made by my noble friend Lord Lamont, that I believe that this session is providing for future historians many examples hitherto not revealed in public of the many aspects of this remarkable lady and countering the sometimes false images of her. And in so doing, I'd like to draw attention to a book which has just recently been published by my noble friend Baroness Shepherd of Northwold, a book which I think is admirable and timely, entitled The Real Iron Lady. Now this book conveys Baroness Thatcher's character, characteristics and values through the personal anecdotes and recollections of those who at various times and in various capacities worked closely with her or were in contact with her. And I think it's a very useful supplement to some of the illustrations that we've been having today. I have a few of my own anecdotes in the book, and I won't repeat them today, but I have three other among many memories which I would briefly like to recall this afternoon, each demonstrating a facet of her strengths. Shortly after I was elected to the House of Commons in 1974, I became a member of the Committee on the Finance Bill, which in those days went interminably and at great length for many, many days through the night in the upper corridors of the House of Commons, going through line by line the various proposals in the Finance Bill itself. Now, Baroness Thatcher was at that point our opposition frontbench spokesman on economic affairs, and so she led on the Finance Bill in the committee stages. On the day of her election as leader, we were actually meeting in committee that afternoon and evening, and I think none of us, and I think some others will recollect this day, none of us on the committee expected her to be with us at all that evening, with the many interviews that she had to give and the many celebration drinks and so on with all of her supporters. So Robert Carr, later Lord Carr, who was then her deputy on the front bench on economic affairs, took the lead in the committee. I happened to be dealing on my feet with a very abstruse and technical point in some aspects of the Finance Bill, in full flow at about 10:30 at night, when to my astonishment the door opened and in walked Margaret Thatcher, and then proceeded to sit on the front bench for the whole of the rest of our session through the night, leading from the front bench. I was so astonished at her arrival and so obsessed with my technical detail that I'm afraid I mumbled a rather inadequate congratulations on her victory. But I think we were all absolutely amazed that she stayed to see the session through. And I think that demonstrates her dedication and her very strong sense of public duty and her commitment to her duty in the House of Commons in a remarkable way. Second, as Minister of Agriculture, I was very much involved in the first full-blown reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, and we had many, many sessions in Brussels on that front. We had got to a point in the middle of the night at one point in Brussels where we were near to reaching agreement, but which went beyond my negotiating brief agreed with the Cabinet. And so I had to refer back to the Prime Minister for her agreement and her authority to go ahead in the way that I wanted to. Now this was about, if I remember correctly, about 3 o'clock in the morning. So I agonized long and hard as to when I should ring her up to get her approval. I rang about 6 o'clock, if I remember, got straight through and heard in a very, very clear voice her response. I think she had clearly been already well up and working on her briefs, and I very much take the point that Lord Armstrong made about this. I got her agreement, and we were able to go ahead. I think that demonstrated her indefatigable energy, her immense capacity for work, and her decisiveness when convinced. And here I'd just like to add 2 separate points on that. On one occasion in Brussels, I collapsed with a burst ulcer in the middle of the night and had to be carted away briefly to hospital. I was astonished the next morning to receive a very large bowl of flowers and a warm sympathy note from Baroness Thatcher herself. Just another example of the many we've heard today of her kindnesses in so many ways, and I was greatly touched. And I'd like also to support very much, because I've certainly experienced this myself, the points made by both Lord Fowler and others this afternoon in relation to the way in which she absolutely tore into you if you were not a master of your brief and in full command, not only of the facts, but the arguments. And this was a bit disconcerting at first, because you thought that in fact she was just basically disagreeing, and you thought you were going to get nowhere. But if you persisted and you knew the facts of your brief, then in fact she would agree. And it took me some time to realize that this was her style, because I recognized that this is actually what I did with civil servants in putting briefs forward to me. I was always overnight looking for the points that I was not happy about or didn't really agree with, and started off with those before in the end agreeing with the conclusions that the paper itself had made. And that was a great feature of all the negotiations that we individually had with Baroness Thatcher. My last example was her final speech in the House of Commons on her resignation, because as leader of the House I was sitting next to her during that speech. It was obviously an immensely difficult occasion for her, and I was very nervous for her. I needn't have worried. She defended her record and achievements with great clarity, power and eloquence, and halfway through was questioned by some members of the opposition, backbench members, and I think it was in particular, if I remember correctly, Dennis Skinner, who had asked her a question, to which she responded with great gusto and a huge response from our own backbenchers. So much so that at the end of the put-down she said something like, "And now where was I? You know, I'm enjoying this." And that was absolutely typical of the way in which she approached any of these speeches, and it was a quite remarkable speech. What a performance, displaying great courage and conviction, which we have frequently heard referred to today. But for me, great courage and conviction were the qualities which I will always remember her by.
My Lords, I joined my noble friend Lord Jopling's Whip's office in 1982, and the highlight of our year was when the Prime Minister came to have dinner with us. This was normally ended with a question and answer session, when her Praetorian guard of whips were treated rather like sort of backsliding leftists, but it was always a very invigorating occasion. It was a great honour for us when she then suggested that she might return the favour, and we might come with our wives and have lunch at Chequers. Unfortunately, that never happened because the Brighton bomb came in between, and so instead there was dinner laid on in Downing Street for both the Lords and the Commons whips. And that ended in the same way, with the Prime Minister saying, "Right, now, has anybody got any problems?" or any concerns that they'd like to raise. And I remember it was my noble friend Lady Trumpington who actually raised the first question about pensions, and she got slapped down pretty swiftly. And then John Major, who was the Treasury Whip, piped up, and he said, Prime Minister, there is deep concern in the country on the following number of issues. And she went for him, such as I have never seen. And the row erupted of such seriousness that we all got very, very concerned. It ended on a very sour note. We thought John Major at one stage might even walk out of the room. And we were very, very concerned that he'd possibly completely destroyed his political career. As we walked from the dining room to the drawing room in Downing Street, Dennis Thatcher came up to him and said, "Don't worry, dear boy, she gets like this sometimes." And the next day, she reconciled the position with John Major, and 3 months later, he was a junior minister in her government. That story is becoming better known. It is very significant because it indicates the sort of woman she was. She loved the row, but she never had any feelings of bitterness. She respected people who stood up to her, and she never actually held it against anybody at all. I came to get to know her much better in 1987 when I got made her PPS. If I'm brutally frank, I wasn't terribly good at the job, and I did very badly when Alan Clark came to see her. He was Minister of Trade, and I totally failed to tell the Prime Minister, which I don't think she was aware of, that Alan Clark always rather prided himself on having two attributes of Adolf Hitler, namely that he was a vegetarian and that he hated fox hunting. And so his pitch to the Prime Minister was that he considered it would be a very good idea if labels were put on furs saying the fur that is being sold here has been caught in an extremely inhumane trap, and so forth, rather like sort of health warning on cigarettes. The Prime Minister was absolutely appalled by this and turned to him and said, "Alan, what on earth makes you so concerned to do this?" And he said, "Well, Prime Minister, didn't you know I'm a vegetarian?" To which she looked at him and said, "But Alan, you're wearing leather shoes." To which he drawled, "Well, I don't think you expect your ministers to wear plastic shoes, Prime Minister." Needless to say, the pleas got absolutely nowhere because the calculation that Alan Clark had not made was that, of course, the Prime Minister was MP for Finchley, and many of her Jewish constituents were furriers, and the last thing she was going to do is ruin their business. She was very interesting. She never read the daily papers. And I always remember taking this up with her at one stage and saying, "Well, I do not read the daily papers." We used to get the most wonderful summary in Downing Street every morning from Bernard Ingham's press department, which summarised absolutely everything that was in the daily papers. I give my eye teeth to get hold of that today. It was a brilliant piece of work. But she used to say, "I never read the daily papers," she said, "because they write such harmful and personal abuse about me and my family that I could never get the job done that I have to do." At a time later, when John Major was Prime Minister, and he was having his problems with the media, I raised this with him and said that she never actually read the daily papers, and he looked at me as if I'd gone slightly weak in the head. But I certainly think that part of her thing in life was you had to do the job you were faced with, and it really wasn't good enough reading the papers every day, or you just couldn't get on with what needed to be done. I always remember there was a meeting in Downing Street held at 5 o'clock in the evening to discuss a policy paper. And I thought this would all go quite calmly. I knew that the Cabinet Minister who was presenting the paper was a friend and somebody she supported. And he had no opportunity to actually present his paper as such. She launched into him and said, "Strikes me," she said, "the problem with this following thing," so forth. Another furious argument took place. Left us all slightly looking at our feet and wondering, goodness, where's this all going to go? She always kept to the timescale, half an hour for the meeting. We were coming at the end, and she summed up, and she said, "Of course, I agree with absolutely everything you're trying to do here. I just thought I'd be devil's advocate to make sure that you thought out all the arguments." Now that is one of the reasons why she was a very great Prime Minister. As the leader of the Conservatives, she was always terribly bored that the Socialists had something called Socialist International. And she thought this gave a lot of respectability to left-wing parties, and she couldn't quite understand why the Conservatives wouldn't have the same thing. So she very much party to setting up something called the European Democratic Union. It later moved on to be the International Democratic Union. And although she never took me as her PPS on foreign trips, this was a party political occasion, and so I went off with her to Berlin because the IDU meeting was being chaired by Chancellor Kohl. We sat in the most enormous room in the Reichstag building, and this was, of course, before the wall came down, and Chancellor Kohl gave a sort of speech to welcome everybody and so forth, which I strongly suspect was written by somebody else. She just made a few short notes, and when it came to her opportunity to speak, she pointed through the window and she said, "People tell me that the building we can see over the Berlin Wall, out through this window, is the headquarters of the East German Intelligence Service. People also say to me," she said, "that they're probably listening to every word that we are saying here today. In which case," she said, "I would like them to know." And she then went into a great tirade about how freedom was what we were all fighting for, and that freedom would actually conquer in the end, and how right she was. The wall came down not very much later. The Right Reverend Pellet, the Bishop of Oxford, made allusions to the fact that she was brought up as a Methodist, but she was always very much an adopted member of the Church of England. And when I was sitting with her in the House of Commons waiting to vote late in the evening, she was going on about the worrying question of women priests. And she said she didn't think there should be women priests in the Church of England because she thought it would split the Church of England. I took issue with her, and I said, "I don't think, Prime Minister, as a woman Prime Minister, you can really take objection to women becoming priests," I said. And then I don't know what you're so worried about. I think women are capable of greater spirituality than men, and also they're less prone to sexual temptation. "Oh, I don't know about that," she said. As always happened with Margaret Thatcher, she never agreed that you won the argument, but it was some weeks later that Bernard Ingham put out a very small press release saying Prime Minister Thatcher backs women priests, and so forth. So she did come round in the end. The Noble Lord Armstrong made reference to the fact that she could survive on 3 or 4 hours sleep. I had spent quite a bit of my time travelling in an armour-plated Daimler, where, of course, the roof was lowered to make it more bomb-proof, and there was a very inadequate air conditioning system in it. We normally had very large policemen and drivers sitting in front, and the heat used to accumulate absolutely massively. And I have to say that both she and I used to nod off quite regularly. It became rather embarrassing when my wife went around saying Archie spends much of his time going around sleeping with the Prime Minister in the back of her car. She first came to stay with me in the country shortly after she stood down in the January of 1991. And it was interesting. We were sitting there in the evening and the telephone rang, and John Major was ringing her up to say that the hostilities were about to begin in the Gulf War. Needless to say, she stayed up the whole night listening to the wireless to listen to what was going on. I was Minister for the Armed Forces and went to bed and listened to the news the next morning. That may be one of the reasons why she was Prime Minister and I never was. But it was an indication of the fact that she did have this extraordinary determination to be involved, and of course it was a war which she'd been very much involved with in the beginning. Thatchers came to stay with us quite regularly from that moment on, and we even had them stay twice for Christmas. But it was shortly after Dennis died that she came to stay with us down in Devon. And at that stage she was still thinking that Dennis was alive. There was a period of her life, which was quite short I think, which went through, and she hadn't really reconciled the fact that he had died. I think it's so regrettable that so much of that film, The Iron Lady, should have been stacked up on the period in her life when she thought that her husband was still with us. But I don't think she was ever really the same again after he did die. and I think it did knock her very hard. He was a great companion to her, and I think life was extremely difficult for her from that moment on. She was a very great lady. She was an evangelist. She wasn't like most modern politicians. She had a mission, and I think everything that she stood for will survive her. From my point of view, it has been a very great privilege to have served with her and to have served in her government.